from TeachIllinois.com. This is the Teacher's Classroom, the podcast that explores current issues and topics in education and how they relate to teaching and students. Here is your host, Matt Weld.
Hello and welcome to Episode 7 of the Teacher's Classroom. Today we will be talking about childhood trauma with Dr. Tali Raviv from Chicago. If this is your first time listening, thanks for joining us and be sure to subscribe so you will be notified of new episodes. The Teacher's Classroom podcast is produced semi-monthly and is supported by the Area 5 Regional Offices of Education in Illinois. Information about the podcast can be found at www.teachillinois.com, which is an online professional development platform. Today we are going to be talking with Dr. Tali Raviv, and I am excited to have her on the show. She is the Associate Director of the Center for Childhood Resilience at Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. She has been with the Center for Childhood Resilience since 2009 and has more than 15 years of experience in community and school mental health. Dr. Raviv's work focuses on increasing knowledge and awareness about the impact of childhood trauma on children's development and well-being, and translating evidence-based interventions for traumatized youth to schools and community settings. She has particular expertise in program development and evaluation for at-risk youth and families, including those exposed to poverty. Dr. Raviv also provides clinical mental health services through Lurie Children's Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry through the Trauma Treatment Service and General Outpatient Services Program, with a specific focus on youth exposed to stress and trauma. Dr. Raviv has published work in the areas of school mental health, child maltreatment, risk and resilience factors for youth exposed to stress and trauma, and the dissemination and implementation of evidence-based mental health programs. Most recently, she co-authored the resource book, Creating Healing School Communities, School-Based Interventions for Students Exposed to Trauma, which is one in a series aimed at supporting clinicians who are working in schools and communities. And I'm honored to have her on the show. Good morning, Tali.
Good morning, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing very well, and thank you for your time and lending your expertise. It seems like trauma has gotten a lot of attention recently in Illinois, and I'm really excited about that.
As am I.
I bet you are. It seems like you do a lot of work in Chicago.
Yeah, we do a lot of work in Chicago, but increasingly we're, spreading past Chicago into the neighboring suburban districts and even into other areas of the state. We've done a lot of work for a few years now with Champaign schools, for example.
I am so excited to have this topic being at the forefront of education. So as we get started, I read off your impressive resume. Earning a PhD is quite an undertaking, but what led you to earn a PhD in trauma specifically?
Yeah, so my PhD is actually in child clinical psychology. And when I first started out, one of my real interests was in the kind of achievement gap. And looking at factors that led to this kind of persistent gap in academic achievement for ethnic minority youth, and especially for youth kind of living in poverty or low socioeconomic status. And so I started to become really interested in what are the forces that really lead to those disparities in academic achievement. And so my initial graduate work was really looking at families living in poverty and what are the stresses and strains associated with the day-to-day challenges of living with less than you need, right? Food insecurity, job insecurity, mobility, maybe homelessness. And as I started to work with families in poverty, I saw, the amazing strengths that a lot of these children and families possessed, but then the huge, enormous challenges that face them on a day-to-day basis. And as I started to look at the challenges, I started to realize it was more than just stress, but it was really much higher exposure to things like traumatic experiences, such as, community violence, family violence, and other types of, really significant issues that affect childhood development.
Well, and so that then led you to your current work in trauma. And so as we look at trauma in schools, like can you just give us like an introduction on what that looks like? Like, why is it such a big deal right now? And why should we make it such a big deal?
Yeah, so I think that, there has been interest and awareness of trauma for a long time in our society, dating back to, people would talk about World War II veterans coming back shell-shocked, after the trauma of war. And then there was another kind of resurgence around, war veterans after Vietnam. And even now there's a lot of attention in military families about the impact of trauma. But it took a little longer for people to really understand that trauma does not just exist in those extreme situations of war, but really exists on a day-to-day basis in many of our neighborhoods, communities, and families, and really affects childhood development. So not just mental health, but also, actually brain development. And so when we think about educators and what they are charged with, developing academic competencies, cognitive skills, but also kind of those soft skills of helping kids learn how to interact with one another in positive ways, how to solve problems, how to manage, the stress of the day to day, we really see that for children exposed to trauma, all of those tasks are much, much more challenging. And I think we are increasingly understanding two key pieces. One is the real prevalence of trauma and traumatic experiences in all our communities. So not just those that are, traditionally underserved or, living in poverty. But this is something that happens everywhere. So estimates range from 50 to 65% of kids will experience a significant traumatic event before they turn 16. Now, we know also that not all those kids are, experiencing long-lasting cognitive or mental health effects, but it does impact development for all of those children, and they may need a little bit of a different kind of support if they have those experiences. And we also have learned a lot about, in addition to the prevalence, really the impact that it exerts on brain development, health, physical health, and mental health.
So it's really the prevalence that's come to the forefront of, even in school communities that don't necessarily have a high poverty population. Mm-hmm. Right. There are still like half of the kids have experienced some kind of traumatic situation. And it's my understanding that trauma isn't necessarily like sexual abuse or neglect or anything like that. Is that right?
Well, it could be a wide range of things. It could be, the kind of the most, well-known or recognized are the things like sexual abuse or physical abuse. Increasingly, we're getting a lot of more attention on community violence or domestic violence, family violence. But it could be other things as well. We have communities where there are separations from a primary caregiver due to incarceration or deportation. That is a trauma for a young child to be separated in that way from their caregiver. We have discrimination and racism and interactions with police that can be traumatic for kids and families. We have things like homelessness, transitional living, but then there's a whole range of, accidents. I worked with a child who lost a sibling to an accidental drowning and the effect that has on a family, or losing a parent or loved one to an extended illness like, cancer or things like that. So there is a real range of what we consider traumatic. And the way we define trauma is not just the event itself, but also that the experience of the event induces a prolonged kind of stress response. And so that can really range from person to person.
So you bring up the subject of resilience. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So two kids, even siblings, may experience the same event and one may have a different response than the other.
Absolutely. So we talk about things that can predict more resilience or less resilience, right? It really is about risk and protective factors. So for a child who has one single exposure to a trauma, even if it's the same trauma as, the neighbor down the street, if that child has not experienced other forms of trauma, if that child has a really supportive caregiver, if that child doesn't have pre-existing mental health concerns like anxiety or depression, if that child has, strong connection to his or her community, is involved in athletics, is, a strong student, all of those are protective factors that can really minimize the risk that that child will have long-standing effects of this one-time exposure. When you look at the, neighbor down the street, if that child has had multiple exposures to stress and trauma, if that child has a family system that maybe was not as intact or that was also exposed to the same trauma and is struggling to, rebound. If that child had any pre-existing mental health concerns or learning disabilities, that child is going to be less likely to bounce back without more targeted mental health support.
Yeah, that sounds completely logical. And so as we look at the classroom now, so we've kind of talked about what trauma is and how it affects kids differently. But as a teacher, then what would behaviors look like in the classroom, or even learning differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's really what we're trying to help teachers understand, that what does this look like in the classroom? So when I, see a child and I'm looking for trauma symptoms, from a mental health perspective, there's really 4 categories of symptoms that I'm looking for. One is re-experiencing. So a child that is constantly reminded, having intrusive thoughts about the trauma, thinking about it over and over again, maybe having nightmares at night. And so from a classroom perspective, if you think about a child who's constantly being reminded of the trauma, who's constantly thinking about it, that can look like distraction. It can look like having trouble focusing on what's happening in the classroom. And if they're having nightmares and difficulty sleeping, which is a really common symptom for kids and adolescents, then they can look really sleepy and they can look like their head is down on the desk and they look disengaged. Another category of symptoms that we look for from a mental health perspective is hyperarousal. So what we're talking about there is always being on edge, looking out for danger, feeling like jumpy. And so that really can affect the classroom setting, because a child who's feeling like danger is always lurking is very on edge, is not relaxed, is maybe also not concentrating on what's happening, is overly focused on loud noises, maybe fearful of things like fire drills or changes in routine because they don't feel safe. Another category is avoidance or numbing. So after a child has had an intense emotional experience like a trauma, they often don't want to think or talk about the trauma or reminders of the trauma. They really want to stay away from that. And they often kind of numb their feelings because they felt so overwhelmed in the moment of the trauma that they just don't really want to feel. So that child can look like they're socially withdrawn, not playing with other kids, not engaging in the classroom setting. They can look like they are avoiding things like school. Maybe they just kind of are staying home. Maybe something in the school setting is feeling unsafe. So they often absenteeism results from trauma. And the fourth category is just negative mood, negative thoughts. So we hear a lot from students like, well, what's the point? The world is just a bad place. I'm never going to, do anything much. So really kind of this hopelessness about the future, feeling like they really are kind of sad and down. And so in the classroom, a lot of times that's, just lack of motivation to try, just very kind of negative thoughts and negative mood.
Well, it sounds like you just touched on every negative behavior that teachers deal with in the classroom: distraction, loud noises, and kids always up and about, avoiding work and social interaction, hopelessness. So what's the mindset shift that we as educators need to go through when we look at supporting these kids?
when we do our trainings, we do this little trick question where we say, we just describe a child, right? Maybe a third grader who is, always up and about, always causing distractions, creating, avoiding work, creating scenes in the classroom, really easy to anger. And we say, does this child have ADHD? Does this child have a learning disability? Does this child have a behavioral disability? Or is this child exposed to chronic stress and trauma? And, teachers answer one or the other, but then really we show them, option E, which is it could be any of those. What we want the mindset shift to be is, instead of thinking of that child as a lazy kid or an unmotivated student or a child with ADHD, we want teachers to consider the possibility and to ask a little bit more about whether these behaviors could be related to stress and trauma, because how you react to a child who has their head down in your class and is sleeping and is not doing work, if you know that child the night before was lying awake all night because there were sirens or gunshots in their neighborhood, or because their father came home drunk and had a loud fight with their mother, or because they were homeless and sleeping on the couch somewhere the night before, you might approach that student a little bit differently than you would if you thought this is just a child who is, lazy and unmotivated. So that's really the mindset shift, that we want people to see behaviors through what we call a trauma lens, understanding that behaviors might be about more than if you don't look beyond the surface.
I can see that responding to kids in this way might be seen by some, I'm thinking of specific teachers I've known in my life, as kind of coddling kids and, they just need to buck up and deal with the situation. How do you respond in your work to teachers like that?
Well, I think that there are certainly teachers who struggle with what does it mean to see behavior through a trauma lens. And we try to make it really clear that this is not about excusing behaviors or letting kids off the hook. It is about giving them the right kind of supports to succeed. So when we look at, a functional behavior analysis in the classroom, understanding the function of a behavior helps you identify what is the right approach to fixing that behavior. What's the right type of support that a student needs? So if a child is avoiding work because they don't understand it, you give them tools, additional help, a small group pullout, remedial instruction to help them understand the work better. If they're avoiding work because it makes them anxious, then you might need a different type of intervention. If they're avoiding the work because they have difficulty focusing, that's a different type of intervention. So we really want teachers to understand the source of the problem so that we can approach it and remediate it in the right way, not so that we can excuse the behavior and say that it's okay and we just need to ignore it.
Right. So it sounds like the team approach in schools where, like the social worker and speech and all those people are in constant communication with the administrators, with the classroom teachers. Hopefully they have time to meet regularly and discuss kids. And especially I found communication would break down between grade levels. You would get a kid figured out in one grade, and then the next year the grades would just start all over again.
Yeah, they would have to figure it out all over again. Well, one of the things that we work with schools in Chicago and other districts on is something called a behavioral health team. It's through, an RTI or an MTSS kind of teaming structure. And the idea is that if we train classroom teachers to understand all those symptoms that I talked about earlier, and to say, wow, some of those might be related to trauma. Let me try some different classroom interventions. Right. And we do train teachers on what are some classroom interventions they can start with to support students who they suspect might be exposed to trauma. But if those behaviors persist, then we might say, let's refer them to the social worker or to the psychologist or to the counselor to do a little bit more screening to see whether trauma is really part of the picture here. And we do have some evidence-based interventions for group interventions for traumatized students. One is called Bounce Back for elementary school students, and one is called CBITS, the Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools. And so some students will need that additional support in the school setting from those interventions. That's kind of what we consider at the tier 2 level. And then if they're still not responding to that, they may need specialized referral either through an IEP or to a community-based provider for kind of a tier 3 intervention. But there are things that classroom teachers can do to support students exposed to trauma. And my book, the Creating Healing School Communities, which you referenced earlier in the introduction, provides some information both about what classroom teachers and what the whole school environment can do to support students exposed to trauma, but also more specific resources for clinicians in schools who want to provide those tier 2 or even tier 3 interventions to target symptoms of trauma in the classroom.
Perfect. So I'm glad there's a resource out there, because I know as a teacher with admittedly very little trauma in my background, I have no idea how to approach kids, I know you have the best of intentions, you want to support them, but my toolbox is pretty empty. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I feel that's common, and teachers, I hear from teachers all the time, well, I'm not a social worker. I don't know what to say. I don't want to say the wrong thing. My husband is a teacher, and so he has the benefit of coming home and saying, wait, what should I do? Right. What should I say? Not everybody has a psychologist in their home to consult with. So I do think the school mental health professionals are an enormous resource. But of course, they are very busy and in short supply, and time to collaborate with them is an even shorter supply. So there are resources for teachers to learn more. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, that the website is nctsn.org, has a toolkit for educators that talks about common signs and symptoms and a few things they can do in the classroom. It also has, the NCTSN also has a resource guide called Creating, Supporting, and Sustaining Trauma-Informed Schools that gives kind of a whole holistic approach, 3-tier, MTSS or RTI approach to how to create schools that are trauma-informed that support students. So those are a few resources. There are a number of books. I've known lots of schools that that do a book study on some books related to trauma-informed care and how to support students in the classroom. So for those that don't have the benefit of, having district-wide, professional development on this topic, I think there are many places to start. Another resource that I recommend for people is a TED Talk by Nadine Burke-Harris that talks about the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that study. So can I take a moment to kind of talk about that?
Yes, that was a question coming up. So perfect.
So we hear the term. So I don't know, maybe, how many of the audience, I think it's becoming more prevalent to hear the term ACEs or Adverse Childhood Experiences. So this was really a landmark study in the 90s that was done by the Centers for Disease Control along with Kaiser Permanente, which is kind of a insurance company. They looked at about tens of thousands of adults who had health insurance. So these were working class, middle class, upper middle class families, individuals, because they had health insurance. And they asked them about 9 experiences that they had prior to age 18. And those included things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, having a parent who abused substances, having a parent who was incarcerated. So these kind of risk factors that we talk about. And then everybody who did this got a score from 0 to 9. If you had all 9 risk factors, you would get a score of 9. If you had 0, it would be 0, and they were additive. And they found, first of all, kind of what I mentioned earlier, that the prevalence of living with these types of adverse childhood experiences was way, way bigger than they had known previously. They also found that these go together. So if you had one, you were more likely to have more than one, which makes sense because some of them, obviously, if you have a substance abusing parent, they are also more likely to be incarcerated, and possibly you're more likely to experience physical or sexual abuse, right? So they did tend to cluster together. And they found across a range of outcomes that if you had, for example, 4 or more of these ACEs, you were way more likely, significantly more likely to have outcomes such as adverse mental health outcomes like a suicide attempt or significant depression. But what they were surprised to find is the impact on physical health. So things like cancer, heart disease, and stroke were much more common in individuals who had ACEs scores of 4 or more than in those who had fewer. And so once that kind of came to really the consciousness of both health and mental health providers across the country, we've started to understand and to do a lot more research on why, what are the mechanisms that make those childhood risk factors lead to those health and mental health outcomes. And some of them are social, and some of them are really biological in terms of how the brain functions. So when we talk about with children, if they're exposed to chronic stress and trauma, the part of your brain that is responsible for the fight or flight response, for seeing that car rushing towards you as you're stepping off the curb and helping you jump back fast enough to avoid that car without even you having to pause to think, that's a fight or flight response. That's incredibly helpful and adaptive and keeps us all alive. The problem is that the fight or flight response, when that is happening, it shuts down your thinking and your problem solving, the frontal lobe part of the brain that we're trying to develop in kids, right? The kind of, if you do this is going to be the consequence. Because in a moment of emergency, you don't need that fighter. You don't need that frontal lobe. You don't want to stop and think. You just want to jump back, right? It also shuts down what the brain thinks of as non-essential functions. So your digestive system shuts down. Your, all your blood rushes to the extremities. And so you are ready to fight or run away as fast as you can. And it also activates inflammation processes in the body, because if you get injured, the inflammation actually helps you survive. But what we know is that for kids exposed to chronic stress and trauma, that fight or flight response is constantly being activated. And it takes longer to kind of shut down once they realize the danger has passed. So we've all kind of had this fight or flight response. If you've ever reached into your bag and suddenly you can't find your brand new iPhone, right? You get that rush of adrenaline, your heart is pounding, your palms are sweating, and you're not thinking clearly. And then you realize you're actually talking on your phone and you're holding it to your ear. And that's why you didn't find it, right? That's the fight or flight response. And for most of us, the minute we realize that, we're like, oh gosh, I'm, such an idiot. And you go back to baseline. But for a child who that's constantly happening, if they're living in a neighborhood that they're constantly on guard, if they're living in a home with an adult who is unsafe, that fight or flight response is constantly being activated. And once it's activated, it takes longer to go back to baseline. And so that has profound health implications, because that's not healthy for us to have adrenaline and cortisol rushing through our bodies so often, especially when we've got developing bodies and developing brains. And it's also shutting down those important cognitive things. So they're not thinking about the math lesson you're teaching if they've just had that fight or flight response triggered. And so, somebody drops a book and it makes a loud noise. Most kids might get that startle response, but for those who are exposed to trauma, that's going to last longer and take a longer time to go back to baseline and for them to get back to whatever the lesson was. So that's this all started from talking about kind of how we are starting to recognize more and more the prevalence and pervasive impact of trauma, especially on things that teachers care about, like the ability to learn in the classroom.
Right. And so this ACEs test, is this something that schools should be giving all kids, or is this something that's reserved maybe for a clinical setting? What's your advice on that?
So there are different opinions in the field on that. I will say that screening for trauma on a universal level for all students would potentially have some benefits because I think a lot of kids who are struggling with a lot of traumas just fly under the radar. Many of these kids are kids who are anxious, quiet, withdrawn, not coming to school. Now, some are the kids who are on the other end of the spectrum, acting out, behaviorally disruptive, inattentive. And so those kids often get mislabeled as, behavior problems versus kids who are reacting to trauma. But either way, I think the idea, the awareness and the diagnosis and the identification, I guess, of students who are struggling with trauma is way under recognized. So universal screening would help with that, certainly. The risks, though, are that once you identify those kids, some of them may need specialized mental health services, and many schools just don't have the resources to do that. So typically what we recommend is a more targeted approach is for teachers who are kind of in the best setting for recognizing problems that they see, because they're with students all day long. They know them the best. If they see these behaviors, whether or not they know of a trauma, and sometimes teachers do because they know families, but sometimes they don't because these things happen, privately behind closed doors, and families are often reluctant to talk about these things. That the teacher, if the teacher has tried strategies in the classroom to support the child, to provide safety, routines, rituals, positive reinforcement, and if those are really not working for the teacher, that they refer to a mental health professional in the building or outside of the building to really do a more thorough investigation of whether trauma could be playing a role, and then what types of specific interventions could be helpful for the trauma symptoms.
That sounds like good advice. As we finish up here, you hear about trauma-informed schools. So we've talked about what teachers can do, the trauma-informed lens, which I've heard a lot. As we move toward a trauma-informed school, just briefly, what would a well-functioning trauma-informed school look like?
So a trauma-informed school should not look different than most other well-functioning schools. So one thing that I always caution our listeners about is that this is not just one more thing. This is not an additional program or an additional initiative. Really, when we talk about schools that are trauma-informed, we're talking about having everybody in the building have an awareness. So first of all, that education piece, that trauma lens. But then we really talk about three key pieces. One is really making sure that kids in schools feel safe. So especially students who have experienced traumatic events, often safety is not there. So making sure that students feel safe in the schools. The second key piece is relationships. So a focus on positive relationships with adults, not just the classroom teacher, but all the adults in the building who interact with kids. So this is not just a teacher's initiative. This is about the lunchroom folks and the security people and the gym teacher and the after-school programming staff. So really kind of emphasizing strong relationships in the school. And the third piece is really helping to teach and support emotion regulation for kids. So we really see this as part and parcel of the Illinois state standards for social and emotional learning. We know that kids exposed to trauma often struggle with those pieces of social and emotional learning, with positive social interactions, problem solving, managing strong emotions. And so the focus should be on helping to support and teach those skills in the school setting that will help kids be more emotionally healthy. There's a lot more information on kind of the whole framework, both in my book as well as the NCTSN document that I mentioned earlier, that is about the creating and sustaining the kind of trauma-informed framework. So there are resources to learn more about these. We also talk about classroom practices as well as having those tier 2 interventions that I talked about earlier. So having specific interventions to support students exposed to trauma is part of that trauma-informed framework.
Great. So your book, is it readily available, or is this like a textbook thing that you have to search for?
It's available on Amazon.com. It's also available. You can click the link on our website if you want to learn more about our center at childhoodresilience.org is more information about our Center for Childhood Resilience and how we work to support schools to become trauma-informed, as well as how we work to provide training in those evidence-based interventions for trauma that would be provided in the schools. So there's lots of resources out there. There are also links on our website to other resources that could be helpful for educators.
And that's childhoodresilience.org, correct?
Yep.
All
yes.
right. And so I could talk a lot about this because there's so much that I feel like I need to learn. But if you could make a Post-it note for teachers to put on their computer so they see it all the time, what would it say?
I think the big Post-it note, the big mindset shift is I would say, is this child reacting to chronic stress and trauma? And I think anytime you have that child that's pushing your buttons, or that child you feel you cannot reach despite everything you've tried, that child that is withdrawn and not engaged, that child that when they don't come to school, you breathe a sigh of relief because you know your day is going to be easier in the classroom, and we all have those. If that teacher could look at that Post-it and say, is this child responding to chronic exposure to stress and trauma? I think that would help shift the mindset and shift how they approach that child in a positive way.
Perfect. All right. Well, Dr. Raviv, thank you so much for your expertise today. All right. So thank you all for listening to the Teacher's Classroom, which is part of the Illinois Area 5 Professional Development and Innovation Initiative. I'm your host, Matt Weld. Please subscribe and share today's episode with your colleagues. You can follow Teach Illinois on Twitter at TeachILPD, and I can be found at Matthew Weld. You can find and subscribe to the Teacher's Classroom on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Stitcher, as well as your favorite podcast apps. So it's signing off. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and I'll see you next time right here on the Teacher's Classroom.